So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you once again to our November keynote for Congregational Conversations. And I want to give a real special thanks to Professor Berlinerblau and also Professor Johnson for giving us this evening. I had originally scheduled them for December and January for 2 lectures. And when things changed, they were so gracious to us to be able to rearrange their entire schedules and spend their time putting this together for us. And I'm so delighted they're here with us tonight. As you know, our Congregational Conversations began with Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast. We followed up with meetings, both individual, and then we did a collective meeting with our partner ministers from Shiloh Baptist Church, Conti AME, and also John Wesley AME and Howard Divinity School. And we were so delighted to have them and our partners to join us this evening. This evening we have 2 incredible individuals with us, our own member from our congregation, who's so generous with his time, Jacques Berlinerblau, the immediate past director of the Center for Jewish Civilization, and actually turned this into the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown. He's the Rabbi Harold White Professor of Jewish Civilization there. He is has 2 PhDs, one from the New York School of Social Research and one in Near Eastern Languages and Literatures from New York University. Dr. Berlinerblau is also been at the Edmund A. Walsh School for Foreign Services at Georgetown University. Dr. Berlinerblau has published a wide variety of issues ranging from secularism to religion to politics to Jewish American fiction to African American Jewish American relations to American higher education. His articles on these and other subjects have appeared in numerous scholarly journals. He's published 7 books with 2 more forthcoming. These include How to Be Secular, A Call to Arms for Religious Freedom, Secularism on the Edge, Trumpet It, The Use and Abuse of the Bible in Today's Presidential Politics. And that's why I couldn't get through him in these last weeks. Every media consultant was on with him. The Heresy in the University, the Black Athena Controversy, and the Responsibility of American Intellectuals. His latest book is Campus Confidential, How College Works or Doesn't for Professors, Parents, and Students. He and Professor Terrence Johnson have a book forthcoming that I'll speak about in a minute. We're also delighted to have Terrence L. Johnson, who is an associate professor of religion and politics in the Department of Government and senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He's an affiliate member of the Department of African American Studies and of Theology and Religious Studies. He is the author of Tragic Soul Life, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the Moral Crisis Facing American Democracy, and serves as a co-editor of the Duke University Press series, Religious Cultures of African and African Diaspora People. I could go on. There is about 2.5 pages of articles that he's contributed to, but I think the best statement that I can make is that according to very personal notes that I have from Georgetown students, both Professor Johnson and Professor Berlinerblau are considered 2 of the most engaging students. I've been told that their classroom is the Socratic method. It is one of the places that the word on campus is that you better do your reading because somebody wants to know what you actually think about what you've read, which is not the usual situation in a college classroom. They have a forthcoming book that you'll see in the chat called that is coming out very soon called Blacks and Jews in the United States, an Introduction to Dialogue by Johnson and Berlinerblau. And tonight they're speaking to us, Black and Jews, where do we stand? Where do we go? Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to get myself off of the spotlight and turn it over to the smart ones.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Jennifer Millstone. Thank you, Stephanie Tankel. Thank you, WHC. Thank you, everybody here. Thank you, Professor Johnson. It's really important to say thank you. So what we're going to do is, because we didn't know that this was going to happen so quickly, Terrence and I moved from classical to jazz, right? Our book is classical. This is jazz. There's going to be a lot more improvisation. And over the weekend, we got together and we came up with some questions that we wanted to ask one another. My surmise is you know me better and are less interested in me than you might be in Professor Johnson. So I'm gonna, we're gonna ask each other questions and talk like we do in class. But for a while, I'm gonna be asking him what he thinks. And in particular, I want Professor Johnson to share with you some perspectives that we might not always hear at WHC, right? And that's really the object, I think, of this dialogue. So before we begin, Professor Johnson, good evening. How are you?
So a little better now, but
Better?
doing well, and very excited to join the congregation today for this discussion, and excited, yeah, to see you again and to figure out, how do we sort of dice through all these major issues that will come up tonight.
Yeah. Just so you all know, we've been at it now, Terrence, for 5 years. We've been teaching our course. Why don't you tell them a little bit about our course?
So yeah, so it's if I might say, I think it's an original course. It really speaks to sort of the best, I think, of liberal arts education. We bring together literature, film, music, um, you know, political philosophy, and some theology to sort of think through really difficult issues around Blacks and Jews in the U.S., but also we do talk about Blacks and Jews in the diaspora to an extent. And and I see the course as really trying to grappling with some of the fundamental issues around American democracy, right? This idea of how do you deal with, right, deep differences? How do you deal with religion in public life? How do you deal with the ongoing problem, right, of racism and anti-Semitism? And how do you deal with sort of growing sort of class divides? And I've argued since even before I met Jacques, and I taught this course at Haverford College with two other colleagues, that when you look at Blacks and Jews in the US, you really get a glimpse as to the American project, both good and bad and in between. So I'm always really excited to teach the class to my students, in part because I think it opens their world to a set of narratives that people have intentionally, I think, sort of buried, right? Because it is painful. And it's a reminder of a possibility of an ideal that maybe went wrong, but it's also a reminder of the kind of struggle, right, that both groups have had in terms of trying to realize an American dream. So anyway, yeah, and I think it's great. And what I appreciate about what Jacques brings a very critical kind of voice to the table. And what I appreciate is that, even with this critical voice, the criticism is more deconstructive, right? Based on deconstruction, this idea that you push and you push to try to unfold, not to destroy, but to unfold and kind of shed light on something. And so it's always great to kind of just watch him, right, do his magic as he thinks through these problems, and he pushes me in terms of my somewhat conservative ideas. So it's always interesting. People think I'm going to be the more radical one, whereas in fact, Jacques is the one who's really, I would say, a bit more unorthodox, and I'm the one, right, who's sort of tied to institutions, and I want to believe in institutions, and sometimes believe in the kind of core of how institutions can be very transformative. So anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, but it's been a great joy to work with Jacques and to really watch the class unfold, and also to meet some incredible students.
Likewise for me. And teaching with Professor Johnson has been a unique joy because we're actually very similar in a lot of ways in terms of character, and we both love art. So we might just start talking about movies and music. We do that sometimes, much to the chagrin of the political science majors. When Professor Johnson referred to my special magic, I think he was referring to my unique capacity to infuriate every audience I speak to. So that'll be my job tonight. Without further ado, let's start. What I'd like to do is I'm going to ask Rabbi to put up an iconic image, and I want to kind of pick Professor Johnson's brain on this one, okay? So we're going to look at this iconic image. We all know it, but this to me is kind of the center, not the starting point, but the center, looking forward and backwards from this point of African-American Jewish relations in the United States. Professor Johnson, anything you free associate on this is going to be fascinating. So why don't you give it a go?
I mean, this is a picture that we use, right? I think to construct a history around Blacks and Jews, right? We see, and also of religious pluralism in a strange way, because the Catholics try to kind of come in and take some of our joy. But when we think about the civil rights movement, right, we think about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Heschel. And those two really become the iconic figures for thinking through, right, the movement, but also this idea of a kind of narrative of Blacks and Jews sort of as sort of being partners and being allies politically and religiously. And also, I think America turns back to this picture to say, wow, look at what we made possible, right? This idea that Blacks and Jews can come together, we can hear their concerns, and democracy has changed. And now these people have equal rights. And so this is the kind of narrative we use to begin the course, because again, it invokes a kind of constructive narrative that we then want to push back on.
So Terrence, you're very close with the great Professor Susanna Heschel, who is the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Do we need to point him out? You all see him in the picture. Here's the bearded fellow with the glasses, not the sunglasses. And Terrence, the two of you are tight in a way that I have great respect for Professor Heschel. I don't know her well, but the two of you talk theology a lot, which is not my love language, but I think theology and politics is your love language. What did the two of you speak about theologically when you look at this image in terms of the theological, intellectual synergy between Reverend King and Rabbi Heschel?
Well, no, it's an interesting question, Jacques. I mean, I think for Susanna is this whole idea of thinking through, right, the monotheistic tradition and what binds a group, right? This idea that we have a God who really sits on the side of the forsaken, the oppressed. And for the children of Israel, it is a deliverance. And for African Americans, it's this idea of seeing the Exodus, right, as the possibility, right, of their own freedom. And so, on the one hand, you have an existing tradition, i.e. Judaism, and you have African Americans who look at aspects of Judaism through the Hebrew Bible and then write themselves into it. And so in some respects, it speaks to the kind of clever use of interpretation, what we call hermeneutics in the classroom, but also speaks to a certain kind of theological cohesiveness, right, that is woven into the story of Blacks and Jews that becomes really important, but also really salient, right, for the American project. Again, it speaks to this idea of religious freedom, and in some respects, it speaks to what some people call the proper use of religion in the public life. These two men, right, exemplify that example.
And there's the Exodus theme and the prophetic theme. So why don't you, if you could speak to the congregation about the way the Exodus theme, well, we know it in our congregation at WHC. Tell us a little bit about the centrality, as Albert Rabbitoe pointed out, the sheer centrality of the Exodus theme in African-American Christian religious thought, and the way these ideas mesh at this moment, Selma, Alabama, 1964.
Great question. So for many African Americans who are Protestants, right, in what we call the Afro-Christian tradition, and again, it's called Afro-Christian tradition because the segregation. African Americans could not worship in an egalitarian way in Protestant white churches, and so starting around 1787, they began to separate and form denominational churches that were primarily African American. And one of the major themes, right, within these churches is this idea of the Exodus story. And what's interesting is that the slaves, according to Henry Louis Gates, who's a professor at Harvard, and a guy named Alan Callahan, when they saw the Bible, and one slave in particular saw the Bible, he says, I saw the slave master reading the Bible, and I actually saw the Bible talking back to him. And so that night, when the slave master was somewhere on the ship, the slave, according to the story, went looking for the Bible, and he found the Bible, and he sat and he watched and said, okay, I need you to talk to me the same way you talk to the slave master. And so this became a kind of sort of tradition of reading the Bible, right, as a living book, but also as a book that talked back to people. And so people didn't see it necessarily in a kind of Catholic, traditional Protestant sense, in terms of you look for texts to affirm a kind of strict doctrine about sin or about, love or sex, sexuality. But in fact, you turn to the Bible, right, as a guide, as a resource for thinking through your particular dilemma. And so when slaves would actually hear the sermons around Exodus, right, from the master, but then also the master say, well, look, your freedom is not now, but your freedom is promised in heaven. Many rejected that and said, no, we think that if God can actually liberate these people called the children of Israel, then God can also liberate us. And so it became this really interesting way that sort of galvanized African Americans around their theological commitment to God, in terms of, we know that God has made certain promises, and now we're waiting for those promises to emerge. Then also became then a kind of secondarily a political commitment, right? Because again, these churches, became, according to Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the primary institutions, right, where African Americans could think through issues around theology, but also through politics. And so she calls the Black church a kind of counter public sphere, in that these are the places where, unlike in other public spheres where you could go to city council meetings and talk about, the politics of the day, African American churches became these kind of counter publics where one learned about scripture, one learned how to behave as a Christian, but also one was sort of taught certain skills around what does it mean to live in a civil society. A number of our schools were started from these contexts. So the Exodus then really plays a pivotal role, both theologically and also politically, for African Americans within the historical context. And so using Exodus in terms of, and seeing Martin Luther King as a kind of Moses figure, right, who's really opening up the Constitution, right, which for them is a kind of an extension of this Hebraic tradition, right? People then are emboldened to believe, we now have, a sign from God, right, through a figure like Martin Luther King Jr., through a figure like Fannie Lou Hamer, and now they are opening up the Constitution and pointing the way to a kind of freedom land.
All right, great. Terrence, before we close the frame, anything you want to ask me about the image?
No, I'd love to hear your comments in terms of Abraham Heschel and what does this mean for the Jewish community, but also, Heschel's sort of role in sort of thinking through the prophets, which is clearly what he wrote about, but also how Heschel then in some ways embodies, at least in the American context, a kind of American prophet.
Yeah, I've always found Heschel's position here anomalous, right? How this conservative rabbi, that should have been a reform rabbi, right? There should have been a rabbi way out on the left. Now, I'm not a scholar of Heschel's work, and I clearly see what the theological affinities were, Terrence, between Heschel and King, and they had a personal affinity as well, which is always very, very important. I never quite understood how a representative of the conservative movement came to take such a bold and brave stand. I would have assumed it would have been more something with reform. And even the reform synagogues, as we point out in our book, were hedging on civil rights, which brings me to one of my, shall we say, unseasonal observations. In the book with Professor Johnson, I've pointed out that in many ways, this image has pacified Jewish American communities to a certain degree. It has given them a celebratory sense of their participation in what I think is the most important struggle in American history, though I wonder if it, in a way, misleads. And we could go into this deeper in the Q&A, but in the book that Terrence and I wrote, as we read about rabbis in the South in particular, as we read about the very complicated politics of desegregation and support for the civil rights movement and support from, we realized that many Jews were on the forefront. Usually they were more secular, they were younger, but their parents often were not. And I've spoken in this forum about the rabbis, who I think generally did a very, very good job of leading the Jewish American community towards a much more egalitarian understanding of what America is about. By the same token, they were constrained by their congregations, who were often either opposed, but in more cases, physically frightened of getting involved in this movement, and for good reason, or given the ferocity of white supremacy in the United States. So I'm happy, Terrence, that every synagogue in the United States has this beautiful image. I have nothing but crazy respect for Rabbi Heschel. I know there are thousands of rabbis just like him, just like our rabbi, Rabbi Lustig, who are deeply, deeply invested in this issue. It's not talk for them, it's action. By the same token, I think the Jewish American community has to look inward a little bit and look more carefully at those Jewish Americans that either turned away or didn't participate or actively opposed the agenda of civil rights. So I have a sort of jaundiced view of this image. I'm struck that it appears in every synagogue I've ever been in the United States, except for an Orthodox prayer space, ultra-Orthodox prayer space, I should say, ultra-Orthodox. I see this everywhere. I think the next step for Jewish America is to have a conversation about what's great about this photograph and what we could have done better as a community. Terrence, any thoughts before we move to our next frame?
No, I think that's really profound, Jacques. And I actually want you to just say just a couple more sentences about why you're shocked that Rabbi Heschel was involved, given his orthodoxy. Because as I've been, yeah,
His conservative ordination.
yes,
Because it was a position I saw from the rabbis who were really in the Reform denominations.
mhm.
This is before Reform and conservative Judaism became much more similar in the last 20 years, ideologically and politically. And it just doesn't seem like a position that would emerge for him. Now, there's Mordechai Kaplan, who also emerges from the same space and does something very, very radical as well. So this speaks highly about the way we were training our rabbinate at mid-century in the United States. We were creating heretics, I think. We were creating rabbis that would speak truth to power and were willing to infuriate other rabbis and the communal Jewish establishment. He was a big thinker. I think their personal relationship had a tremendous amount to do with this, as often happens in history, right? But I just find it interesting that he's in that space, as opposed to far more liberal rabbis in the South, right?
Sure.
Who we knew about, who were writing, especially in Atlanta and Miami, who are maybe in the back row, right? Or maybe not there for whatever reasons. Terrence?
No, I think that's a great observation. And I'm also wondering the extent to which, and again, I don't know his sort of the theology that undergirds his training, but to what extent does his experience in Poland then allow him, right, to in some ways, as an expression, bear witness, right, to the suffering of African Americans in this country, but also then in some ways, what were the conditions that allowed him to see the ways in which the prophets are actually speaking to this moment? So there's something about how he's reading, right, these ancient texts, and not simply applying them, but in some ways, I think feeling their possibility for that moment. And so I don't know, I find it quite refreshing, but also very telling that you see the link between sort of experience and experience in a way that is not restrictive, but experience in terms of bearing witness to other people sort of suffering.
Yeah,
And that speaks to all the characters who emerge in the movement, who are these sort of radical thinkers, whether it's a Baldwin, again, or Ella Baker. How do we open up the very possibilities given what is familiar to us?
So I'm definitely not an expert on Heschel's work. I would point you to what I've read about him. Much
Yeah.
of the great stuff comes from his daughter, Susanna Heschel. So there are two taproots. One is clear cognizance of the Shoah and the European catastrophe and a real sensitivity to the plight of the underdog. There's no doubt that's there. But there is a considerable Hasidic theological taproot to his worldview. He was reading the prophets as well, all right? Certain prophets, as I like to point out, not the prophets aren't always as politically left as you might imagine. If you read through all of them and you get a doctorate in Hebrew Bible, you learn that the prophets can say some really, shall we say, non-progressive things, but sometimes they say some very progressive things. And he locked on to those, Terrence. But Hasidism and mysticism clearly influenced him in a way that I think few rabbinic authorities were influenced by that body of work, right? It took him here. So God bless him, and we thank him. And I just want Jewish American communities to think about the centrality of that image and have we lived up do it. Terrence, do we tell them what Susanna Heschel said? Can we preview our book when we asked her about this image? Do we dare do it? Because it's not out yet.
And let's wait.
Let's wait, okay? Put it this way, Susanna Heschel shared some of my views, and she was a lot harder on the Jewish American community than I was. That's all we're gonna say. Read the book when it comes out, everyone. So we're gonna go to our second question, and now we're gonna bring it forward. 50 years later, Professor Johnson, we're in a very, very different context. And there's this tight, tense, taut, somewhat thriving African-American, Jewish-American dialogue. And one thing that comes up again and again from non-Jewish African Americans, I keep using that term, non-Jewish African Americans, because there are Jewish African Americans, is the following. The complaint that Jewish Americans have become white. And this is something I hear in a lot of my teaching, and I also hear it from Jewish African Americans, by the way, all right, that the community has engaged in a facile embrace of whiteness. So rather than having me explain that to all of you, I want to hand it off to Professor Johnson. And Professor Johnson, without taking a side on it, could you please explain the sentiments, plural, around this issue that you might hear in your community and help us better understand what I think is really important for getting to the core of this discussion?
Sure. So I think that there are kind of two anecdotes I like to sort of bring to the table. One is that emerged from a conversation I had with Rabbi Gil Steinloff, and his his article on challenging Jews to sort of rethink their role in society, and this whole idea that arguing that Jews have sort of abandoned the traditions of Judaism around social justice and chosen whiteness in part because of safety, because of the rise in the professions. And then there's also kind of a narrative that I sort of, I've been aware of just familiarly in terms of my own community and in conversations with students, is idea that, again, as, immigrants attempted to and believe in the American dream, right, there was one path, and it had everything to do with assimilation. And so E. Franklin Frazier, who writes about the Black middle class, and Melvin Herskovitz are kind of really two interesting kind of characters who sort of think through this problem, right? And it had everything to do with this idea for E. Franklin Frazier, who's arguing basically with Melvin Herskovitz, who happens to be a Jewish anthropologist, around there are debating over African retentions. And Herskovitz is saying, look, I see a lot of things that's happening in Brazil, that's happening in Nigeria, that's also happening in the American South. And we have to sort of claim a certain kind of lineage around African religions in the American context. E. Franklin Frazier is a trained sociologist from Chicago, can say, what are you doing, right? We're trying to become American. And the more you invoke Africa, the less likely we are to achieve this American dream. And so at issue, right, in the 40s and 50s, even among intellectuals, is this idea of how do we sort of cultivate a sort of historical narrative, right, and anthropology that shows African Americans as human, right, as ordinary, and just like white Americans, right? And so, and part of that had everything to do with assimilation. Of course, there are always other counter narratives, but in terms of the kind of the mainline sort of HBCU model of thinking through, right, liberation, it was everything about assimilation and appealing to this idea that we too can become Victorian, just like white people.
But that didn't work, Terrence. I mean, in other words, what the Black Power movements showed us in the 60s was the idea that America was open to receiving persons of African ancestry, regardless, right, of phenotype, was a sort of lie.
No, sure.
And the theology just moved, and the community moved to a more Black is beautiful framework, a more separatist framework, a framework that didn't cherish or fetishize assimilation. And that left the Jews as the old partners from the old days who also bought into that idea that by just working hard and assimilate. So what I'm trying to say is, in our class, Terrence, this comes up a lot. That liberal promise, what's sometimes known as racial liberalism, worked really well for Jewish Americans who became whiter and whiter and whiter and whiter and whiter. The promise was not kept for African Americans. And herein lies some of the tensions between the communities. Would you concur?
No, yeah, and I would just sort of, I want to push back on one point in terms of, I think when you look at the archives in terms of what Stokely Carmichael is saying and what some of the SNCC writers are saying, they're arguing that their issue with the white Jews who were in SNCC is this idea that, well, your ideology is reflective of, right, the ruling class. And they didn't have issue with you moving to the suburbs or issues with professionalization. It's actually, what are the ideas that you're bringing? And you're now beginning to suffocate us in terms of, wanting us to follow a very similar path, when in fact, we can't assimilate in that way. Like we're getting rejected. And so part of what the move in Black Power does away from civil rights movement is saying, look, we have tried now for a generation to fight for equality. It's not going to happen. So let's actually now align with the third world countries and have this alliance outside of the US and really make our case to the UN that discrimination in America is a human rights violation. And they picked that up from Malcolm X. But interesting enough, who's pushing Malcolm X are a number of African American women who are challenging Malcolm X in terms of the ways he's thinking about the issue of Islam and gender. And so this whole issue then of thinking through, right, whiteness really becomes ideological. And Black Power is pushing back and saying, well, I want to see white Jews have an ideology that's reflective of the struggle that they were once fully committed to. But now, right, tensions emerge as people, again, when your zip code changes, it's going to affect, right, what you see and don't see. And that's going to then affect how you respond to political dilemmas. So when you're in the urban communities, right, and folk are living on top of each other, it becomes very clear what the issues are in that community. But when you're not a part of the community, it becomes very difficult.
Terrence, can you tell us a little bit, because I think this will recenter the discussion. Give us a 2 or 3 paragraph description of an article we read together. It's like the classic. It's James Baldwin's. The name of the article is Negroes Are Anti-Semitic Because They're Anti-White. And it's a paradigmatic article in Blacks and Jews scholarship and discourse. And I think he just gets to the core of it. So would you be so kind to just kind of paraphrase the argument for us so we understand what the stakes back then and maybe even right now might be?
No, in a nutshell, Baldwin says, look, when Harlemites are frustrated, they don't see a Jewish owner, they see a white landlord, right? When they're frustrated because the butcher is giving them poor meat, they see a white butcher. And so Baldwin's trying to argue, look, what Black folk are upset with the ways in which white ideology is manifesting in these bodies that happen to be Jewish bodies. And then the second argument is that while we're fighting with each other, the real issue is this idea of Christianity. How Christianity then becomes the real issue in terms of not only pitting Jews against Blacks, but also the source of our suffering. And so he argues that really the wake-up call is for sort of the Christian influenced government to rethink certain norms around how folk are operating and how people are living.
And fast forward to today, the accusation that Jews are white / have become white, where do we find, is that salient in the general? The African-American community is super diverse. We're talking about millions upon millions of people, like 14% of the American population. Where do we find that argument? How mainstream is it? And what do you think this mostly Jewish audience tonight needs to think about when they hear their African-American compatriots complain?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. I haven't done any studies, and I haven't really read any studies. But when I sort of just talk with folk around 16th Street near Shepherd Park in D.C., historically was a Gold Coast place where Blacks and Jews have lived for decades. When I talk to African Americans about the Jewish neighbors, it was kind of like, what are you talking about? They're white, and so there was no connection. And literally, the park. The phenotype of the park at Shepherd Park would change depending on the day and depending on what was happening at the local synagogues. And sure enough, as the synagogue members actually came out, the park changed race. And then in the afternoons, it became a different color. And these are middle class African Americans and middle class, mostly white Jews, and they're not interacting. And they don't see, people who are educated, they don't see a connection. And so unfortunately, they don't see the social justice, the ethnicity of the Jewish community, again, based on my limited conversation with folk. And I'm hearing the same thing in the classroom, which is why when we're in the course, people are like, well, this is great information, but we don't connect with each other. We don't talk. We're not in the same. We don't live in the same neighborhoods.
So
We don't
something,
attend the same social events.
Terrence, something we noted in our class, I've mentioned this before, is when students come to Blacks and Jews and we tell them about the class, they have no idea that it's about the historical relationship between Blacks and Jews. They
Yeah.
thought it was like a diversity module, like there was a Blacks module and there was a Jews module, and they had nothing to do with one another. It's really funny.
Yeah.
So
And
when
what's really striking is when we read the historical evidence in terms of anti-Semitism and how it's linked, and in particular with Charlottesville, people are stunned, right, to read about sort of these archives in terms of housing discrimination, right, and how basically Black were left out of the whole housing boom. And when the Jewish students find out, they're really frustrated. But again, this history isn't taught, and then they begin to rethink, okay, what is this legacy that I actually inherited? But again, we don't have a public discourse or public kind of setting for people then to work through what is their response. It's not about blaming people for being middle class, but it's about rethinking these sort of structures that we keep duplicating.
I want to go back to your analysis. Your analysis is our students don't know that because American society has become so segregated that there are very few natural spaces where Jewish American kids and African American kids, and we don't even do kids, just adults as well, are dealing with one another as equals in a natural environment, being friends, hanging out. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think you kind of nailed it in the book.
Oh, really? I don't remember. Okay, no. I mean, I would just say, I mean, at one point, I mean, the one place where we will talk to each other is in the locker room, right? That's the one space, and we may listen to the same music, but literally people don't live in the same neighborhoods anymore, right? I mean, look at the DC area, look at Montgomery County, right? I mean, it's hugely segregated. When you look at the top performing schools in the region in terms of whether it's BCC or Walt Whitman, it's just completely segregated. And so there's no sort of social context for people to have these kind of, as Jacques mentioned, these natural relationships. And so when they get to college, that kind of orientation continues. And now we're trying to disrupt, two decades worth of indoctrination.
You had mentioned the Steinloff piece. We found it. Could you just could you close the loop on that? We're going to put up the piece by Rabbi Steinloff. Again, a conservative rabbi, interestingly enough. We're seeing all these conservative rabbis taking these very brave, rather radical stands. And he was at our sister congregation, whose name is escaping me right now. It'll come back in a second.
Is it Addis, Israel?
Addis on Porter, right? On
Addis,
Porter and Connecticut, I believe. Okay, here we
Before
go.
you and I taught the class, he actually came to and spoke, right? Before you taught this
Can we
together.
just put up the Rabbi? Can we just put up the headline so people can see it? This was quite the jeremiad against the Jewish American community, and we're going to put it up in a second. We're going to screen share it.
I don't have it up. Did Stephanie, do you have it? Whoops.
Here it comes. There we go. Could you just give us?
There you go.
Could you just scroll down? That first paragraph is really hellfire, as it were. Okay. And seemingly excellent about the need to grapple with the racism that is so pervasive. The rabbi goes on to say, well, the racism, and this is difficult. The racism is pervasive in the white Jewish American community. I don't know how many friends he made for this, but as I channel my inner Rosa Luxemburg, I very much appreciated what the rabbi was saying. And I think this is what Terrence is bringing to our attention, that in Black Jewish dialogue, a major pillar of the conversation is African American frustration that Jews were offered whiteness and took it, right? They took the opportunity to be white when they could have had something not white, or something that would be indicative of more solidarity with their Black compatriots. So, Terrence, anything you want to add?
No, here's where I want to invoke. This becomes a very tricky kind of argument. So push me a bit, Jacques, if you will, and anyone else. But here's why I think, particularly entertainers, right, have a unique relationship with the Jewish community, because in their eyes, there's a recognition that, yeah, we know you're definitely otherwise. We know that you're not completely white. And at the same time, there's this kind of emulation here. And so that when you hear rappers talk about, and excuse my phrase here, quote, Jewish money or sort of Jewish power, for these young Black guys, I would say for the majority, they simply say, we want the kind of access that you have. And so it's really striking because on the one hand, they recognize that they're other, but also there's something about the whiteness and the power that they actually want to embody and have a piece of. And I think, what Rabbi Steinloff is sort of teaching us and teaching me in particular is this whole idea that, right, power, it's not the issue that you have the power, it's the issue that you have the power and you potentially not use that power sort of to advance a social justice kind of we would say ministry, I'm not sure, or kind of philosophy. And so what's interesting is that I don't hear LeBron James saying, well, I want that Jewish power and the Jewish social justice movement, right? Because you would think that should be a part of the conversation in terms of who are these people that they are emulating. There's only emulating the particular aspect about power. And so I think, at least in terms of their relationships, that is a different kind of I think bubble that we've yet to really tackle, because it's a strange kind of relationship that I think but then speaks to the broader issue, right, around class, around power, and around how a certain social justice message, right, it basically falls on deaf ears outside of middle class context. So I think that's kind of another issue to address.
And many Jews riposte, no community in the United States has a closer relation. It's a very peculiar, as Terrence pointed out, it's peculiar, right? There's no community in this country that has as long-standing, as intimate a relationship with the African American community on issues from civil rights to the arts, you name it, right? We're all enmeshed.
Sure.
Yet there is this frustration in the African American community that maybe not enough Jews have done it, or they haven't leveraged their power in ways that could be more helpful to African Americans. And then you get your right-wing commentary reading uncle, right? Uncle Mike, who says, but I don't understand. Look at this long track record of Jewish Americans taking exceptional interest in African American affairs and African American art and African American social justice issues. And this is the place we're in, right? Where there's really a body of evidence that suggests Jewish Americans have been good friends and good civil rights travelers, right? And
Here's an interesting point, though. I think what's different is in terms of with my grandmother, they knew American Jews who were both supportive of the civil rights movement, but also very supportive individually of individual Black families. And so there was a connection in terms of, okay, you knew that, the Jewish family in the neighborhood for whom you were the daykeeper or the day worker was very supportive of your children's effort to go to college. Now we have a generation of people who only know American Jews, right, who are in positions of power, and there's no intimacy. And of course, the feminists will critique me in terms of, is that a proper sort of relationship in terms of the day workers who are in Jewish homes? But nonetheless, I think for white Jews was a reminder to them, wait a minute, we are good to the people who work for us. And I think that there's a legitimate, yes, you were. But at the same time, structurally, then people are now coming back to say, well, structurally, it didn't have the impact. But individually, yes, we have great examples. And so I don't want to ignore that history. But now we have a generation of people who don't know that history. So they only know people who they see in positions of power, and that's what they're emulating. And then that's when anti-Semitism comes up, because again, it's conflating the power with identity.
Now, I want to get to the current moment in a second. On the flip side, I just want to draw your attention as a group. A lot of the material we read through points to the uniquely deleterious role of Jewish neoconservatives in sort of cracking or fracturing the Black-Jewish alliance. The issue which we won't talk about today, which I didn't know this prior to the summer, the more I read, the issue that might have been not the death knell, but a thing that really, really hurt the relationship was affirmative action and Jewish neoconservative legal action and ideological action and politicking against affirmative action policies in the 70s and 80s. I never realized it 2 years ago when I used to teach Blacks and Jews. The more I read, the more I understood there was deep, deep, deep resentment in the Black community for the way some Jews, a minority of Jews, I want to be very, very clear, right? Jewish neoconservatives advocated against affirmative action, which was clearly seen as a way forward for the community. With that said, Terrence, we've kind of gotten into politics. Why don't we go there right now? Let's talk a little bit about the election, right? Blacks and Jews is an ocean, it's a universe. We're not going to do it in 40 minutes, right? It takes like courses, maybe even a doctoral program to understand all the issues that are here. So the issue we're going to jump to is the following. We're going to talk about poll numbers. So Terrence, you had a question for me about poll numbers about Jews, and then I have a question for you about poll numbers about African-American males in particular. So perhaps, Rabbi, we can put those numbers up for everyone to see. Terrence, what did you find curious about these numbers? Let's show them. We'll be there in a second, everyone. Aha. Did we lose Professor Johnson?
Oh, no, I'm here. Oh, I'm sorry. What?
So let's look at the Jewish number. So what jumps
Yeah,
out at you
sorry,
there,
yes.
or what do you? Those are the African American numbers. If you could just go back one.
I mean, if we go back to the polls, I didn't see anything extraordinarily surprising. I assume Jewish sort of Republican support was closer to 20%, but I think it's at 30. And of course, with the whole African American and Latinx vote, particularly the Latinx men and Black men, right? We saw numbers that went from 2% to 4%, which I don't know if it's that meaningful, because even when George Bush was president, I think we forget that African Americans who were very religious and not socially progressive also voted for George Bush at around 3%, maybe even 4. So I'm not overly concerned about that number. I think what I'm more concerned about is the fact that Trump actually expanded his white base. And to me, and again, it's not like you're expanding your base based upon a kind of Jack Kemp Republican, or for that matter, Mitt Romney Republican. I mean, you're really expanding upon someone who's a fearmonger, right? Someone who's using fear, right, of the other and the threat. And so it was interesting. I heard a woman today on BBC. Literally, she was crying. She's like, "I'm going to die now that Trump isn't president, because we can't have Biden. They're going to kill us." And the woman was in tears. A woman from, they always find someone from rural community, but it was just sort of striking, right, that she felt as if death was imminent. And that's what he's actually invoked. And I think, and that becomes a frustration, not necessarily that people are for a kind of blank Trump, but really people are against the ways in which he has created a certain level of fear of the racial other. And again, he may not be as explicitly anti-Semitic, but his support for Charlottesville was indication, right, of where he really sits on that issue. Because again, I was stunned, as I told Jacques several years ago when it happened, I guess 2016. I assumed that the rally would focus on immigration, about the wall, all the things that Trump explicitly talked about. But they went back to blacks and Jews. I'm thinking, where did this card come from? I mean, no one talks about blacks and Jews anymore in the same sentence unless you're taking a course at Georgetown. And so to me, that really spoke to some underlying issues in terms of, the duplicitous ways that Trump has, I think, manipulated various communities. And, I won't talk about Israel. That requires, I think, real experts. But I'm not convinced that evangelical support for Israel, right, equates to a real sense of justice for Jews in the diaspora.
All right, so let's look at those numbers. Remember, I wrote a book about the use of the Bible in American political rhetoric, how presidents invoke biblical terms. So it's an issue I'm pretty aware of. I want to be clear with you, in 2008, 2012, and 2016, there were errors in the polling initially of Jewish America. This is very important for everyone in this room to recall this, right? The polling on Jews, the exit polls, were initially incorrect. That being said, these numbers should get a lot of Jews nervous, because I'm not so sure the lower end of the number is wrong. All right, so 77% is classically where Jews are. FDR, we were at 90%. Then we dipped down. With Nixon, there was a slide down, obviously. With Reagan, there was a little push up. With Obama, there was but what we've been seeing, probably because of the rise of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community growing in numbers, and because of Russian American immigrants from the former Soviet Union, we've been seeing a slow tilt to the Republican Party amongst the Jewish American population. So as I look at those numbers, Terrence, I want to believe the 77% because that would conform to the classic pattern over the last couple of decades. I'm just going to say it right here. I think it's around 68, 69%, which indicates precisely what a lot of Republican Jews and the commentary crowd have been saying, that the Jewish community is lurching more rightward. And the next thing they speak about is Black-Jewish relations, right? Jews have realized that their interests are not the interests of African Americans, and they're voting their particular interests. That being said, no group, no minority group shows this type of support for Democratic candidates. We have to be very, very clear about that. But yes, Professor Johnson, I do think something is slowly shifting in Jewish America, and that is one of the drivers of the increasing tension between African Americans and Jewish Americans. If we can go to the next slide, though, Professor Johnson, I want to push you a little bit on this, right? I have no explanation for it, and you certainly, this is not your area of expertise, but I want somebody to explain the discrepancy between African American men and African American women. You might point me to a citation. I am flummoxed by it, all right? I'm flummoxed that there were 13% of African-American men voted for Donald J. Trump in 2016, and it went up 5%? Professor Johnson, can you help us make sense of that?
Yeah, I can. And I didn't realize it had gone up to 18% this time. I thought it was only at 4 to 6%. Yeah, I can't explain that. I mean, I think, again, part of it may have been this whole idea that Biden was a part of the initial package around the reform bill and hyper sort of policing. But again, I'm not terribly shocked because, again, we had a significant number of Black folk who supported George W. Bush. But still, overwhelmingly, 80-something% of Black folk, was 85% or 88, voted for Biden. I don't know if this is like a real trend. I just don't know. I'd have to talk to people who study this. And yeah, I can't really explain it.
Okay, so we're seeing that in both communities. There was a slow lurch towards Donald J. Trump, even though the overwhelming majority of men and women in both communities did not go that route. There is a movement, and the movement kind of tracks across decades, and it's something for us all to think about. Final question. We just wanted to end here, Professor Johnson. Each one of us wanted to speak about what it was about our intellectual journey that brought us to the study of Black Jewish issues. Why don't we begin with you?
I'll make it short because we're so short. Oh, wow, it's almost 9 o'clock. I would just say I've always had an interest in trying to figure out how do people sort of talk with and beyond what is very familiar to them. And it sort of started for me in terms of really, at an early age, I sort of recognized sort of the difference between what we call the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And I was always sort of just fascinated by the sort of the church's account of the kind of Hebrew tradition and with the prophets, and then trying to make sense of that through, the person we call the Messiah. But I didn't have the words to articulate, but I knew there was some tension there. And then when I went to college, obviously, I began to study this stuff and even grew more sort of fascinated with it. But I think what happens in graduate school really kind of was sort of a climatic moment for me in terms of really the kind of impasse we have in terms of public deliberations. And I've always felt as if, Blacks and Jews really held the key to kind of thinking about democracy. And I've just sort of stuck with it from there. But all of this sort of stemmed from my Black church experience and engaging the Hebrew tradition. What about you, Jacques?
What about me? There's so many answers to this. I could say jazz, which was something I studied as a young person, but the more I think about it, the part of Brooklyn that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, unlike the America that Professor Johnson and I were describing today, was really integrated, right? It was delightfully integrated. If you lived in Flatbush, and you got, it was called the M train back then, right? You got on the M train, every stop another ethnic cohort would get on, and by the time you got to DeKalb Avenue, right, or Broadway Lafayette, you were shoulder to shoulder with the entire human genome, right? So that experience of growing up in a place where multiculturalism was just your daily, and I believe, Professor Johnson, you didn't grow up in such a place, if I understand. You grew up in a small town. You'll tell us about that in a moment. For me, growing up in that place seemed very, very natural. Right? Brooklyn, New York is the way things should look to me, right? And quite honestly, when I moved to Spring Valley in Washington, D.C., I was in for a surprise, right? It did not look at all like Brooklyn, New York. So a lot of the work I've done in Blacks and Jews, I kind of want to go back to childhood, to what seems like normal America, right? Where you have 50 conversations a day with people who aren't just Jewish, though there are plenty of Jews, right? Which is also great. Right? Jews as far as the eye can see. And there are lots of other people there as well. So to me, multicultural America was the promise of my childhood. That's what I learned about in school. We sang the civil rights songs, the ink is black, the page is white, together we learned to rewrite. That's how I was indoctrinated. And that's the America I want to live in, right? But last question to you, Professor Johnson. You grew up in a small town in Indiana, correct? In the Midwest.
Yeah, in the Midwest. And at the time, all I knew were German Lutherans and African Americans who were, came from the Great Migration. And it wasn't until recently that I discovered that there were Jewish communities in Indiana as early as the late 1800s. I was stunned. But yet, the ways in which we were so segregated, right? And I'm assuming because we have German Lutherans, and I don't mean to laugh, that people were like, I think I'm going to keep my distance. And so, that's what I knew. And it wasn't really until college and I came back home that I discovered there was a thriving Jewish community. But for all kinds of reasons, right? People were segregated. And so I literally grew up in the world that was sort of black and white, American versus, the foreigner. Even in my family, people were very committed to buying American cars, even though Honda was a couple hours away in Ohio. So it's that kind of sort of parochial vision that I grew up with.
And you first met Jews, you told me, when you studied at Morehouse? Was that?
Yes.
That's the first, were they your professor?
Well, that I was aware of. And again, when I went back and looked at my yearbook, I clearly had Jewish teachers, but no one who spoke about Judaism or the Jewish tradition. And as you well know, we talk about in our class, historically Black colleges really became a home, right, for a number of Jews in the 1940s and 50s, in part because Gentile institutions would not accept a number of Jewish immigrants who were highly trained, and so they found a home in Black colleges, and so and really help train a number of people who are now college presidents and provosts and well-regarded intellectuals.
All right. Well, I think now, Professor Johnson, we should hand it off to Rabbi Lustig and Stephanie Tankel. I think people have questions. So thank you, Terrence. That was a great conversation as always. And Rabbi, it's all yours.
So I first have to ask, where in Indiana did you say Fort Wayne?
Yes, Fort Wayne.
Oh, so Fort Wayne. So Archway cookies.
Yes.
and also the Dopp kit, Doppel.
Yes, Doppel. Yes.
From Fort Wayne, Indiana, in terms of.
And it also Lincoln Life Insurance.
Sure, but well, Indiana, few people don't realize that Indiana was and still is the insurance capital of the world, when many places claim it as Connecticut. But that's it's an interesting part of it, because the Fort Wayne Jewish community was a very strong Jewish community. And it's a very interesting situation. There are a number of questions in this, and and it's very difficult because, and this is why I think it's so good that we're going to have you next month as well, to begin to to explicate some of these things in a way, because we jumped really from, and I just want to ask a general question here. I put it in a chat and you began to do it. The two conservative rabbis were really post-denominational. it is not because of their conservatism. This is my belief in terms of their conservative nature in which they got engaged in, or that their movement even support them. Joachim Prince and Heschel were clearly, their experience in Europe and what they had seen in Europe was a driving force in terms of what led them to that. And in the fact that when they came to America, like, and I wanted to do this because you could, if you could speak to this in just in this sense, when Jews came to America, their identity choices were different. They stepped into an American system, which we know in systemically became black and white. And so it was, so they became victims. It's not a matter of choice. And this is a sense, why, if the system is that strong in order to oppress the African-American, the black community over time, why would it not be seen that it was so, that there was no other choice for the Jewish community in terms of that? And you brought up some good examples where they could have voiced choice and the frustration. So I'm sort of interested in that very quickly, because I don't want to get into that history, but then there's some other great questions.
All right. Terrence, do you want to start on that one?
I mean, I'll just say briefly, I think, there are figures like, Julius Rosenwald, right, who actually then sort of countered that, this idea that, look, we have a sort of tradition that we rely on that forces or compels us, right, to speak out against a certain kind of injustice. So he then works with Booker T. Washington to create, 5,000 plus schools. And it's based on a kind of equal partnership model where they both get 50% in starting sort of these rural schools. And so to me, given that one example, there are other sort of similar examples around in ACP work. So there's definitely an acknowledgement that even when you come into the system is actually broken. And I forget the piece we read earlier, Jacques, but the piece that the scholar looked at the ways in which Jewish immigrants, right, were in certain professions that were needed, particularly in Baltimore and this whole warehouse community, right, and how that sort of
Whiteness.
yes.
Type of whiteness.
Yeah.
Gold,
Goldman, right.
Yes, Goldman, yes. And so it's interesting to see, yes, on the one hand, there is this kind of fixed black-white binary, but and at the same time, right, Jews become the perennial kind of other, right? They're inside, but they're not necessarily marginalized, but they're definitely otherized. And so
they're inside outsiders. I remember an Afrocentrist. I went to an Afrocentric rally, and there was a real thoughtful meditation on Jews by the speaker. It might have been John Henrik Clarke, I forget, right? And all of a sudden, the Jews, he said, they're inside outsiders. So you want to go with that, Terrence? I like that idea. They're kind of inside and they're outside at the same time.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the idea that, again, there's a kind of phenotype, right, representation and phenotype kind of beneficiary component. And at the same time, there is a real history of hatred, right, and of violence, right, against the Jewish flesh. And so that's why they're internal outsiders, right? This, on the one hand, they're used and brought here, particularly, you remember we discussed this in terms of with New York, right? The Dutch said, no, we need Jews here to handle the money, right? And because of the whole history, right, of anti-Semitism and money. And so they brought in Sephardic Jews and put them in an isolated community for a particular purpose. And so that kind of legacy, right, continued to unfold. And so it's a very, very sort of ugly history. And also, but I think the history speaks to people pushing against it. So that's what I like to focus on. Well, how did people push against it? And then when did that push actually, or the pushback stop, or at least curtail?
I mean, Goldstein talks about that goes into what happens in the 1920s. I mean, we tend to think about this, or that photo that you put up tends to put this in as a process that begins in the 1960s. And that's really very mythical, because the situation for the Jews and the transformation begins, as Goldstein pointed. Is it Goldstein, The Price of Whiteness, or Gold?
Yeah,
Eric Goldstein, yes.
Yeah, it's Goldstein. He has. There emerged a collective opinion that there was, quote, a Jewish problem in America, and it was addressed with urgency, part of the larger interwar America ethos, which came from withering confidence. White Americans were suffering after World War I and saw a set of distinct problems with a distinct group of people they could blame, the Jews. I mean, he goes through that this shift in terms of it. So it's fascinating. But I think that,
Rabbi, can I add something about this, which I think is really important? And so this is a majoritarian Jewish audience, from what I can tell, right? So when Terrence and I will do this, we're going to be on the road a lot in the next year, right? We're going to shift according to the audience, right? So one thing I want to tell this majoritarian Jewish audience, and Terrence has been listening to this for years, is I don't think Jews have a proper taxonomy of Jewish American history. They're like certain things we don't, we all think our ancestors came here from Eastern Europe between 1881 and 1921, right? And we're all, okay, fine. When those Jews came here, precisely as the rabbi said, they were shunted into a binary which they did not like, they did not understand, and they did not feel a part of, all right? So your boobies and zadis, when they got here, right, from Lithuania and from Poland and from Russia, didn't get this whole black and white thing, and to their tremendous credit, many of them resisted. All right, they joined far left groups, they became communists, right? They worked in labor unions, though there it gets a little trickier in terms of race relations, right? So when we have that conversation as Jews, we're like, oh, that's good, right? Our ancestors came from Eastern Europe, they were wedded to post-Marxist worldviews. Many of them brought into all sorts of civil rights, absolutely. But then we don't discuss the German Jews that got here in the early 19th century and settled in the South, a small percentage of whom owned slaves, right? This has been excised, right, from our collective memory. We don't talk about that, but they were there, all right? They were there. And a couple of African-American historians have noticed it and brought it to our attention, just like a couple of Jewish historians, like Rabbi Bertram Korn, the great scholar of this issue in the Jewish South. So all I'm saying is, for this conversation, Terrence, to proceed, right? Both communities, but in particular the Jewish American community, need a kind of greater self-understanding. I'm going to put the onus more on the Jewish American community in this sense. I don't think we fully understand ourselves, and that's not a curse. There's a lot of great stuff we don't know about ourselves, right? There's so many great Jewish stories I came across in researching this book and writing it with Terrence that made me so proud to be Jewish, especially about rabbis, right? And the heroic things they did. But then there's other stuff which we've pushed to the side, Rabbi. So in terms of the binary, yeah.
We don't talk about the fact that the Baltimore rabbi that was against slavery had to leave his pulpit and flee to Washington because they weren't going to just fire him. They were going to do something else to him. So I want to get to some of the questions. They're excellent questions that have been asked. One of the questions that's in here is that, in full disclosure, and we're doing this in the context of ConCon, we're really seeking to partner in deep and big ways. Last month, we named some of our hurdles. What hurdles have you two faced as you engage together on this topic? How do you persevere? What do you advice do you have for our communities going forward as partners?
I think that's a great question. I mean, what comes to mind for me is this idea. I think Jacques is a bit harsh on the Jewish community, and I often wonder: is your criticism really stemming from this notion of a chosen people? And as a chosen people, you carry a certain burden, and I think that kind of theological provision can be very liberating, but also be very dangerous. And so my fear is that as we are thinking through this, and again, you're at liberty to push your community, but I often wonder if you recognize sort of the limits of who we are in terms of as humans, and this whole desire to persevere and to make do with what we have. And I think there are very few prophets and prophetesses, right, within our collective communities. And so those are the people who often sort of bear the kind of the burden, right, of the kind of persecution, of the loneliness, because they're sort of speaking out and trying to raise, right, the alarm bell. When in fact, I think most people are very comfortable in their silence.
Yeah, you've made that criticism of me that I expect too much of the Jewish American community, and you've gone the extra analytical mile, Terrence. by wondering if it's not some like crazy theological substructure in my brain that actually believes Jews are chosen. It could be that, you know, that Jews just have to be better than everyone else. I accept the criticism. In terms of projects, I like that word projects. I use it all. We need projects, right? And I'd like to think we had so many great interlocutors from the from area African American churches, which Rabbi Lustig set up for us, and Rabbi Shankman last time we met, Rosh Hashanah, I believe it was, or was it it was Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah that we all met, Rabbi?
That was Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur was peace in the Middle East.
Right. So I want to do a project, and I want everybody to like decide together what the project is, and it could be like cleaning up the Potomac, or going to the C&O Canal, or it could be something in Anacostia, or it could be something in Bethesda. I want a project, and I want both communities to say it's a small thing. We're going to do this together, and it's like a confidence building measure, to use the language of diplomacy and statecraft, right? It's a confidence building measure between these congregations. And I think that's where everything begins, because the problem that Terrence pointed to is the problem that there are so few meaningful relationships between African Americans and Jewish Americans and so many other different types of groups. And that's where the meaningful relationships develop, all right? So my advice to everyone is, if you have a friend, a colleague, a coworker, it doesn't have to be African American or Polish American, who's just not like you. The most American thing you can do is to cultivate the relationship, right? And like do things together, right? Whether it is go to concerts or work on projects or visit each other's houses of worship or read books together. And
Or maybe
that's
it's
what I'm
un-American.
thinking is the way forward. Terrence, I'm sorry?
Or maybe it's un-American, because when I think about, I know I can say this, in house, but when I think about the ways in which my colleagues try to warn me about working with you, and as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh my God, it's very anti-Semitic. But I didn't realize it in terms of, oh, you can't trust this person. He's going to turn against you. And I'm like, well, he's the nicest person I've met so far. But then also in terms of what I have, what'd you say? But then also it's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
oh,
Go ahead.
no, then the other point is this whole idea that then I've heard some of my Jewish friends say, well, I want to make sure I'm not getting used by my Black friend or whatever. And so it's just really interesting ways in which we allow these competing stereotypes to prevent a kind of relationship, because people are, I think, by nature a bit fearful at times, right? But then also it's interesting how the very structures, right, reinforce these myths. And again, often we're not very critical. Even I wasn't critical until you just raised this point, Jacques. I was like, oh yeah. When I think about in terms of the relationships, people have been very like, I mean, literally, I've lost, people don't talk to me because they're like, why are you with Jacques? I'm like, well, what is the big deal? And it's one thing, but anyway, I'll just say it. So I think it's interesting. So I think there are a number of hurdles we have to sort of get over as we talk about building these trusting relationships.
Could you just briefly, and we can get into these more, but there have been a number of questions talking about sort of the ones that bubble to the surface pretty clearly, that are bones of contention, the Black Lives Matter, and the identity sort of in what that movement really is, and whether it, is or isn't anti-Semitic in terms of that. And second of all, modern day issues about Israel, because those seem to be divides, not only in the Israel is certainly a divide in the Jewish community, but the Black Lives Matter is also is becoming a point of inflection. So just any comments of those as hurdles?
Terrence, you want to start? I can start on this one. You might want to Google an article that Terrence and I did with PolitiFact, where they asked us about Black Lives Matters and the Jews, right? And they asked me if there was some type of natural antipathy between Black Lives Matters and the Jews. And we were like, well, Elisa Garza, who's one of the founders of Black Lives Matters, was raised Jewish. Right? So let's just start there, right? I think that's a really important fact. Black Lives Matters is different. And Terrence will tell you it's a different political movement with a very different energy and a different approach to activism, which I find very exciting. Doesn't mean I agree with every single plank, but I just find the whole structure of the movement to be interesting. There was a piece on the Washington Post recently, and I'm going to hand it off to Terrence, about how Jews were so conflicted about BLM's critique of Israel, because if BLM had 40 planks, most of these Jewish rabbis agreed to 39 of them, all right? They agreed with every single thing BLM was saying, except on the subject of Israel. So I'm wondering if there's that much agreement in the liberal denominations, and that's us folks, right? Maybe instead of demonizing BLM, which very few of us do, by the way, that's not a Reformed Jewish thing, that comes from the right. Maybe now's the time for those projects and those conversations, right? I mean, maybe we need to bring, BLM has no leader, it's a cephalus, which I find so fascinating, right? Let's have dinner with a bunch of BLM people, right? There might be BLM folks in our own synagogue, right? They're Jewish African-American BLM members, right? Bring them in, let's talk, right? I have no fear of the movement, right? Because I think the movement at its core is moving towards something which is important and just and good for the country as a whole. Okay, Terrence, I'll throw it off to you.
No, you said it beautifully. I would just add that. I think at the very core of BLM is this idea that, and I think you can relate, is really wanting to show the humanity of African Americans. So that the initial sort of call was this idea that, wow, Black lives do not matter, and not in terms of representation or identity politics, but that the fact that literally people don't see the humanity, right? When they see a kid in a hoodie, right? This is the very problem, what Du Bois called the Negro problem. So I do think part of what triggered this sort of this moment, right, was this idea of how do we reclaim sort of Black bodies and show that they are actually human. But also what's sort of driving this is, again, at least two of the three founders, and not all three, right, are, I think, same-sex, gender-loving individuals. And so there's a whole component around thinking about, sexuality, or around love, and thinking through human rights issues. So really wanting to sort of challenge, right, traditionally run African American organizations, particularly Black churches, to really rethink, right, how are we imagining politics, and to do so, right, in a kind of model that Ella Baker started with, this idea that she argues that powerful people don't need powerful leaders. You just need to show people, right, where the resources are and let them determine how best to use them. And so that's sort of the model that BLM is addressing. And I think the Israel piece becomes one of those planks where, as you check off the boxes in terms of, are you a progressive person, right? It becomes an issue of, okay, well, you have to say something about Palestinians. And my pushback is always very interesting, this idea, well, are we thinking very critically around human rights issues around the globe? And I think the reason why people focus on Israel is because people believe Israel is a chosen land for chosen people. And so the expectations are, I think, a bit heavier than other folk. And so that's why I keep pushing Jacques in terms of the kind of criticism. I do think fundamentally people see Israel and American Jews as having a special kind of relationship to other human beings. And so that sort of sparks that kind of criticism. But yeah, so I think I'll end there.
So there are a number of questions. We've talked about the divides, but the conversation doesn't hasn't focused necessarily, as one of our listeners did, about where the natural overlaps might be for the Black and Jewish communities. And you've also talked about this in many of our Sephardic shuls or other things. And there's a whole movement. There are Jews of color as well. And what is their part in this discussion as well?
Sure. I think in part what the connection is, I think the competing uses of sacred texts, right, to define our communities. And we're finding more and more African Americans who are pushing back against sort of traditional Afro-Christian tropes and really thinking through religion in a very critical way. And it's always been the case, but it's even more so now. And I think both groups, right, have built solid traditions around this sort of critical hermeneutical gaze. Again, the Exodus narrative, I think, is something that's sort of galvanized, but also other stories around Esther, right? Esther becomes a galvanizing call for many womanists, right? African Americans who see themselves as being sort of radically to the left in terms of thinking about gender and sexuality. So I think there are a number of texts that we define maybe as sort of sacred, that people actually see as very much in a kind of quote secular way, in a way in which they see very much appropriate for thinking about politics. And I also think, again, the ongoing kind of marginalization and otherization really, I think, again, unites folk. When people see synagogues are getting bombed, or people are murdered and synagogues are murdered in Black churches, again, there's an immediate connection. And even with popular music, right? We see folk like Dre, who's Jewish and Black, right? Really bringing in his sort of culture in very, very interesting ways. That's really like opening up the possibility for African Americans to see Jews of color and think about sort of Judaism as sort of intertwined, right, within Black life. So I think there are a number of ways in which the groups are connecting and have connected. I think the bigger issue is there a way to translate these kind of micro sort of inventions and interactions and expand them?
And I would say some recent survey data indicates they're more than 500,000 persons in the United States who are of African ancestry and refer to themselves as Jews. Now, a sub discussion for a different lecture is whether they are halachically Jewish by the standards of the rabbin. All right, that's not our discussion today. What I just want to bring to your attention is a funny pattern in Jewish American history. Jewish American synagogues, when they have wanted to engage in dialogue with African Americans, have always looked to the churches. That has been the reflex. It's like a no-brainer. All right, what do we do when we want to? We go to the African American churches. My question is, why did so few white Jewish American congregations not look to the African American synagogues, of which there were many, especially in New York, especially in Chicago, and especially in Boston? So that's a complicated question. There's a lot going on there, right? Afro-Judaism is not one thing, but my soapbox issue has been Black-Jewish relations will take a quantum leap forward when white Jewish congregations with our considerable power and resources and finances and organizational abilities reach out to these Afro-Jewish congregations and we start talking. We'll find a lot of things there we disagree on, and we'll find tons of things we agree on, but that is the step not taken in Black-Jewish dialogue, and it bewilders me. It's so obvious, right? There are Afro-Jewish synagogues in this area, in New York City.
It's kind of an interesting thing because you're making a dichotomy there that is almost non-existent, because a Black Jew is a Jew and is a Black, and you're actually bifurcating in a way that is to me is more problematic, but we can talk about that on the side. But in this sense, is that it's the practical sort of sense, is in the same way that there is a difficulty in interfaith relations in reaching out to the Muslim community, because the Muslim community is not organized in the same way as the American Jewish community or the American Christian community. We reach out to churches because they are organized in dealing in the same way. They have figureheads, they have pastors that do, they have social justice in terms of, so there's an avenue in terms of that, and they have a long history of relations in terms of that. We deal with Catholics as Catholics, not as Catholics as Africans. We deal with Black churches as Black churches, not as AME churches or Baptist churches, even though there are theological differences that make those things. Or in our area, reaching out to Glenardia, which is one of the largest African American churches in the country, and it is an evangelical church, and it's such an anomaly in terms of that, because when I partner with them and look on certain social justice issues, we don't theologically, because I don't believe that homosexuals need to go to classes to change their attitudes. So the divisions or slicing these things up it's very, very complicated. And I want to go back to the beginning, because Susanna Heschel makes a presumption. She writes a very, very beautiful article about the intellectual exchange between the preaching methodologies, and actually gives credit to, I believe, that Heschel influenced and Martin Luther King chose the paradigm of the Exodus rather than the Redeemer of Jesus. In other words, you could theologically make all the speeches that King made, that they could have been Jesus centered, they could have been Christian theologically centered, but they weren't. They were centered around the motif of the Exodus, and she brings this out and talks about that. And I'm wondering if that that choice of the motif that you alluded to was somewhat the bridge in which the two communities walked across. Had that not been the bridge, in his hermeneutical presentations, would there have been the same alliance?
Before Terrence takes that one, I have to respond, Rabbi, because I couldn't disagree with you more, with all respect and all love. So I'll ask as a thought experiment, and then I'm going to hand it off to Terrence. I believe it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said the most segregated hour in America is church time, Sunday, right? I want us to look inside our hearts and souls, WHC, and ask ourselves, does that apply to the American Jewish community? All right, when we're worshiping on Shabbat, on Rosh Hashanah, could Reverend King say the same thing about us, that we're given that there is this Afro-Jewish community there, right? And I say this with respect and love for the rabbi. I think there's a conversation we have to keep having, Rabbi, because it's so important.
I don't disagree with you, but that is a Jewish problem. Mm-hmm. And that is, I don't like the bifurcation of treating I think you're falling into the trap that America does. You're putting everything into the racial sort of divide, and that's we can do this off of, but I
have Terrence adjudicate between us, Rabbi.
And there is a whole, for the first time ever, that the first time ever is that the Jewish movements are now paying attention to Jews of color, and they're coming up, and they're all sorts of. So I think you're absolutely correct that there's this awakening of that. I'm interested because I'm really interested because what tethers us, we talk about text, and I believe, when I saw the cinematic murder of George Floyd, what goes through my mind is Al Tamod Dam Re'echa. How can I idly stand by the spilling of another human being's blood? That text is universal to all people of faith on this earth. There is no religious faith, even if you get into Taoism or other things, that doesn't bring that up into the sanctity of life and our responsibility, our moral responsibility. Unfortunately, Abba Shalom, and we lost a great, great Jewish thinker who was able to, despite his limitations of thinkings. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's last book was on morality and brought up this sort of thing that we've lost a sense of a moral core. And this was the sharing between, I'm asking you if you see it this way, Terrence, a sharing between Heschel and King was this shared understanding of text as a moral compass. It led King to understand the issues of and the exchange over the Exodus, and it led King to understand Heschel's understanding of being anti-war, which put Martin Luther King at great risk when he took those stands on.
No, I think it's a really sort of powerful point. And I just want to remind us that, when we think about in terms of African Americans, in terms of as they're becoming literate, right? Frederick Douglass is a prime example. People are reading the Bible, right? And so the Bible becomes sort of their introduction, right, to how one learns to read. And also in terms of what people are hearing. So they're not only learning to read the Bible, they're also memorizing the Bible based on how it's read to them. And that link then goes back to right, the whole Puritan tradition in America in terms of America seeing itself as, right, the New Jerusalem. And so part of what I think is influencing slaves sort of think about the Exodus motif, particularly over and against, say, sort of the Gospels, is the sense in which part of the American story is sort of reclaiming, right, Exodus as a part of kind of a galvanizing motif. And then African Americans come in and say, oh, wait a minute, but I don't think the Pharaoh is simply in Egypt, right? There's a different kind of Pharaoh who emerges. And so with their critical hermeneutics, they come in and really shift the story. And so I think that sort of history in terms of within Black church life is really informing how King is understanding the possibilities of liberation, because at this moment, right, when King's emerging, we don't have Jesus as a kind of liberating figure. Howard Thurman's Jesus and Disinherited, I think came out maybe in 42 or 45, may have been 50, right? Sort of the first text is sort of looking at this idea of Jesus as a kind of, I think he calls him a sort of a Jewish Palestinian or Hebrew Hebrew Jew. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he shows how this is a guy who's marginal, who's a part of an ostracized sort of group, and his message is about love as sort of liberating. And so we don't have this kind of liberation theology, right, as King is sort of developing his whole thought at Morehouse and at BU. And so anyway, so I think this idea of the Exodus motif, right, is sort of understood in the context of American exceptionalism, but also in terms of African American sort of slave hermeneutics. Excuse me. So I think, and that becomes sort of a galvanizing text, right, in terms of or story that links the two. But I also think it's a sense in which I think Heschel talks, Susanna talks about this in that essay, if we're reading the same one, that in terms of how they are approaching the text as a kind of as a symbol, right, that is necessary, right, to be embraced by those who engage the text. And I think that idea of becoming a kind of symbol, kind of a beacon of light, right, representing sort of that tradition in the midst of violence, right, is also a way to connect it, because there is a kind of mysticism in terms of King's reliance upon Howard Thurman that's at play that doesn't quite get unfolded. But I know he apparently carried the Jesus and Disinherited with him throughout most of his career. But again, Howard Thurman is sort of a background player. He's not really talking about race. He's really talking about sort of, reconciliation, about mysticism, about this idea of reuniting folk with this sort of, omniscient God. So I think those three elements are linking the men together.
That's insightful, because we're coming full circle, because you began our discussion of saying that when the when the Black man heard, when the slave heard the master hearing the Bible and wanted to be talked to, and the position of text is clear. Now I want to shift to Jacques, to your other hat of expertise. How do we engage young people if the church and the synagogue and the rabbis and the minister are still talking text, and we have a world in which secularism is the greater portion of our world? Is this generational? Are we able to capture in the same way? Does Black Lives Matter now, and the essence of this movement that has been explosive, and our young people are out on the streets, Black and white, Jew and Christian, Muslim, all in the excitement and the things. I'm not so sure text or what's speaking to them. And you have this understanding, because if we're in this dialogue and still relying on al tamod dam re'echa, don't stand idly by the blood of the other, that means probably nothing to the majority of the people that you're teaching in the college and the majority of the people who are out on the streets.
What a question. I'm really into bottom up of late. I've become a bottom up guy as opposed to top down. So my advice to the rabbis and the ministers, and I kind of saw this when we had Cornell Brooks here, who's just a great friend of the Center for Jewish Civilization. I'd love to hear him speak. He was kind of talking himself, like instead of the NAACP and the AJC and the Council of Rabbis, and instead of them taking this youthful energy and harnessing it and sluicing it off, just look at what these kids are doing, right? And interestingly enough, they're just doing it, right? So my son was at all those protests. downtown in June, all right, the infamous March Through the Park, the Power Prance with the Bible. He was there with his African-American friends, and in many ways, they were leading, right? So I think, Rabbi, the leaders in both communities, and I think this is in the African-American community as well, Terrence, check me on this, have to look at what the 20 and 25 and 30-year-olds are doing, because they're doing a lot of it. So I'm wondering if we might need to like reverse our organizational game plan and just bring these kids in and say, what do you need? All right, how can we help you? Can we introduce you to some scriptural resources or some things that major American Jewish organizations do on these issues? Terrence, what do you think about bottom up?
No, I think you're right. And I think even so the growing kind of contention among young Jewish college students about Israel, I think is a reflection of a kind of spiritual yearning that they're searching. And they maybe they're using political language as a bit discomforting, but I think it's still speaking to a desire for a certain kind of homeland and wanting to reckon with that within this particular moment. And I think with Black Lives Matter, something very similar in terms of reckoning with a homeland at which you are at odds and trying to sort of reclaim it, but reclaim it on your own terms. So in both instances, we see, I think, a deep longing, which speaks to a kind of thirst for, again, a thirst for something beyond the material, a thirst for whether it's music, whether it's kind of improvisation. I don't know how you want to describe it, but there is this kind of, I think, hunger for the kind of flesh of text, right? And so I think I think the search is evident in both communities, and it speaks to why they keep going back, right, to these perennial questions around homeland, around identity, right, that speak to what is not only comforting, but what they actually need. And I think so instead of pushing them away from the table or the conversation, I think you're right, Jacques. We got to figure out how do we bring them in and say, I don't say what you need, but let's actually hear these people out. Because they don't feel as if we are actually listening to them.
Well, I want to thank both of you. This has been very insightful. I'd like to ask, we have a conversation for us that we're going to go in discussion groups on this Thursday. I'm wondering if you could give us, maybe a small snippet from the book that you think we should read, or a particular teaser from an article, because you brought up some incredibly important points, even when we talk about the hurdles in this way. And, we are moving towards what our pinnacle of our goal of this conversation is in March, to have a summit, which is an action summit, to talk about how do we then go and begin to do the work together. And as we talk to the African-American ministers, one of the things that we have to do is to make sure that once this COVID is over, God willing, and the creek don't rise, that this conversation moves off of Zoom into the tables and homes of people driving to Anacostia, or people driving to Northwest, or people driving to Cabin John, or people wherever people are living, to be in each other's homes. Years ago, almost 30 years ago, Renee Prusant did a piece with her uncle, who was a professor at Harvard, Dr. Prusant, and they followed two men who were graduates of Harvard, had done undergraduate and graduate, both had gone and came back to work in Washington. And they worked in similar law offices, one set that they followed, and another were two government workers. They intersected in work, and then in Washington, once they left work, they went to two different separate communities and never had any contact or integration. One of the things that was very clear in Eitan Hirsch's most recent book, Politics is Power, how do we move from what he calls hobbyism to actual change, which is a great thing, is that most of us see all of this as outside observers. And hobbyism, and our children were in the streets. They're the activists who are meeting and having relational exchange, whether it's having a a bottle of water in front of, St. John's Church and talking to someone, whether it's sitting down on the curb and, trying to wipe the pepper spray out of their eyes. They're having experiences and exchanges that are being very important, and we need to talk about that relationalism. So we want to really, I want to thank you for all that you've done for us tonight. I hope that you'll give us a short reading list and some key questions for this Thursday. But this is greatly insightful, and we look forward to continuing next month with furthering this dialogue and this understanding. And we want to thank you both, and especially on such short notice. This was wonderful, the dialogue between us. And whatever you think on the reading list and whatever you think on the action list, we take it very seriously. I want to thank Stephanie Tankel for continuing to do this. I want to thank my partners, Chris Zacharias from John Wesley, Beverly Goins from National City Church, Dr. Yolanda Price from Howard Divinity School, Shiloh Baptist, Wallace Charles Smith, and Reverend Thomas Bowen, and also the good Reverend Mark Thomas from AME Conti. We value so much your partnership, and we look forward to this. And to Professor Johnson and Professor Berlinerblau, thank you so much. It is almost past my bedtime, so we thank you, and we really appreciate it. We look forward to it. And ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't registered for Thursday's conversation, please do. It'll be a breakouts for discussions, and we're most appreciative for your participation.
Thank you.
Good night, one and all.
Good night.